Welcome to Leominster Access Television and Neighborhood Snapshot, a series of interview programs focused on the historical neighborhoods of Leominster. During our interview, our guests of the present time, through sharing their memories of the past, will be creating a record for the future citizens of Leominster. My name is Bob Saudelli. I am a member of the Leominster Historical Commission. Our neighborhood snapshot today is the Bowery neighborhood, and our guests, and we're honored to have them, are Alice Emory Pickford, Louis Cocci, and James Gardner. This is Louis Cocci next to me, and James Gardner in the middle, and Mrs. Pickford, Alice Pickford. And we, as I said, are honored and pleased to have them. They all grew up in the Bowery neighborhood of Leominster. So welcome, Alice, Jim, and Louis. Now, before we start our interview questions, I went to the dictionary, and a Bowery, quote, is a farm or plantation of an early Dutch settler of New York. And New York was originally New Amsterdam. When the Dutch got there, they of course found the Native Americans, but it was originally Dutch, and it was a farming area, a Dutch plantation area. That's the Dutch connection. And the dictionary also said the Bowery. It has a negative connotation. The Bowery in New York City has a negative connotation to it, and it's understandable that a misunderstanding arose in Leominster. Folks who are new to that section of Leominster, who didn't grow up there, it's natural and normal that when they saw the sign go up that they perhaps misunderstood. We're going to try to clear that misunderstanding up today, because the Bowery was a good place to grow up in. The Bowery neighborhood of Leominster was a good neighborhood, and it is a fine neighborhood today. But it is understandable the concern of those folks who didn't grow up there and didn't know that there was that connection. It is a good neighborhood. It was a good neighborhood. You folks grew up there. First, for the audience of Leominster, I'm going to direct this to Jim. Jim, where is the Bowery neighborhood in Leominster?
The Bowery neighborhood is split by Union Street. There's actually two areas. There's the left and the right side. I was born on the left side, which is the side that goes to down to Central Street, and then there's the west side. That's where Louis Cocci here was born, on the west side, which was way up beyond Coburn Street. Actually, that's as far as it extended. It did not continue through to Pleasant Street at that time. And when I was a boy, Tisdale Street did not extend it to Central Street, but it was not passable because a section of the road was completely sand, and a vehicle could not penetrate that deep sand and get to Central Street. It was possible, but it was very difficult, so it was not used back in the early days. So that section was always known as the Bowery. And as long as I can remember, when I was a small boy, it was still called the Bowery. And when that name started, I don't know how far beyond that it was.
Jim, a question. Excuse me. It obviously extended down. How far down Union Street, going back toward town?
Well, you could say it extended down as far as Crown Street. I think you lived on Crown Street, did you? Yes?
Yes.
You could say it extended that far. It encompassed quite an area, and it was not not easily defined, but
They didn't have it marked on.
no, you couldn't
wards
say,
or-
you know, it went to certain distance. It was just that general area. But basically, it was Tisdale Street. They did put a sign on Manchester Street, but that should have been on should have been on Tisdale
Tisdale.
Street. And one of my neighbors complained bitterly to town officials that they put the name Bowery on the wrong street.
And it should be
And it should be up on Tisdale
Street.
Yes, that has always been known as the Bowery. That section,
that area.
that area.
Now, you still live in the Bowery section of Leominster,
I
Jim.
live on Manchester Street, which is still considered the Bowery. Yes.
And Louis,
Yeah.
you still live in the Bowery
Live in the
area?
Bowery.
And Alice lives,
I've moved over to, I've lived, I think, in every ward in the city except 4. With redistricting, I live on Main Street now.
and now on Main Street.
Main Street.
Jim, you mentioned when you were a boy it was called the Bowery. Now my next question, we know where the Bowery is. When did you folks live there? When were you a boy, Jim?
I was born. I lived at 88 Tisdale Street all my life. I wasn't born there. I was born just around the corner on Union Street. But shortly after I was born, we all moved to 88 Tisdale Street, and I spent my my youth there. And
Would that have been in the 20s?
that would have been in the yes. I was born 1914, and it would take you up through the 30s. Yes, and I think we were most active in the late 20s and early 30s.
Okay, so you folks grew up in, depending on when you were born, you saw some of the pre-Depression era, you saw the Depression era, you saw pre-World War
Yes,
II, World War
yes,
II,
the
that area. And it was called the Bowery all during that?
all during that
All
time.
during that
Yes,
time.
and we were a kind of a club, like we organized a ball team, a football team, and we played various other sections of the town. We played Lincoln Terrace. We played the Carbine Boys. We played
The Plains.
the Hollow Boys up there off Exchange Street.
The Car
Morse
Brothers.
Hollow.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we played all those different teams, and
So,
but we never had very good equipment. I don't ever recall playing a baseball game with a good ball. All our balls were always taped because they'd been used for so long. They had no cover on them, so we had to put bicycle tape on them.
and these games were just pickup games,
Just
right?
pickup games, yes.
They weren't
Yeah,
highly
no,
organized.
No, we had no equipment to wear. We just
May I ask you something? You know, I don't mean to sound like a woman's liber. However, what were the girls doing?
I
all
was
this
going to ask
time?
you, Alice, what
Well-
did the girls do?
the
They
girls
were
did.
all doing babysitting or playing with the dolls.
No, the girls in those days were kept under the wraps pretty well.
Well,
Especially the Italian families absolutely would not let their daughters out after dark. They kept them.
They were
kept them in.
probably
So
ahead of their time.
The girls really were never part of our.
When the boys were playing football across the street from the house, my two sisters were not allowed to watch them play. I remember that.
You know,
We're not allowed to watch them play.
That's right.
Is that right? Oh,
My
they
mother wouldn't let my sisters
Italian
watch
mothers.
play football.
Can you remember, though, what a scandalous thing it was if a young man of Italian extraction started dating a girl of Irish or English extraction. I mean, that, you know, neither family was too charmed. I mean, there was still a great deal of ethnic
Yes.
prejudice and suspicion and so forth.
Yeah. That's true. I have an aunt who, when Louis is saying that the girls weren't allowed to they were watched very closely, and my aunt was they were watched very closely, and I'm sure that was so in all the other nationalities.
Yeah.
But it's so true that from these interviews we're learning you know, the neighborhoods at that time were very close-knit, and they were of national origin. That's how people settled. There's still a degree of that today, but it's changed, and that's all for the good. And everyone eventually melded into Americans. We're all Americans.
The melting pot is what made this country so great. But
Yes, there was a big influx of Italian people during that period, and
but Jim, it was still a very friendly neighborhood.
oh yes, oh
Because,
yes, very friendly people, absolutely.
My neighborhood was Anglo, Irish, Italian.
They took.
But I had a foot in both camps in that my mother, who was born in 1887, was of Irish, Catholic, Democratic persuasion. Maybe not necessarily in that order. And she met my father, who was a New Hampshire Yankee, Protestant religion. And neither family was charmed with the other. But it worked out, but it was different. I had exposure to both, but I can still remember, even with the slight antagonism marriage-wise, there was still a very neighborly, a warm feeling in that your next-door neighbor knew pretty well what you were doing, or you were playing with her children or his children. And I think our mothers were the recreation directors or the social directors. She'd open the door, you know, and go play during summer vacation. You'd show up at lunchtime or supper time. Do you remember walking up to Lake Samoset to go swimming in the summer?
Every day.
Through the sky, through the...
Every
Yeah,
day.
we didn't stop at Richardson.
And
Sometimes
no
twice a day.
lifeguard, no lifeguard.
Richardson's Pond.
No
None of us could swim. We all learned to swim at Samoset. The bottom was so mucky, you'd sink up to your ankles in the muck, so you had to learn to swim quickly to get your feet off the... But then the boys, they would peel these leeches off
Yes.
each other when they got
Bloodsuckers, we call them.
bloodsuckers,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
peel them. I mean, it was gross. And then they'd have matches, and they'd turn these poor, whatever the creatures were, inside out to...
That would
anyway,
kill 'em.
I mean, it was... But surprisingly, I don't think we lost anybody up there, did we? Other than a few bloodsuckers.
No, they were in
Oh.
Richardson's Pond. There was a lot of them in Richardson's Pond. That was the worst,
Yeah.
worst pond around for bloodsuckers. And yeah, they
But
didn't.
imagine today trying to turn loose your kids, not being able to swim, learning on their own, no lifeguards, no adults present, just a bunch of goofy kids. And the boys would be doing handstands to perform in the water. And we would walk, we'd spend all day walking from Crown Street or Tisdale Street or Manchester Street, up Union Street, down Grant Street, is it, to Samoset? Unless we went through, whose pasture was it?
Conway's pasture.
And we always used to
Cut
avoid
across.
the obvious, so you don't step in it.
Yes.
And we used to...
Yes, there were cows in the pasture.
But we used to swear there was a bull in the pasture, and of course we wouldn't know a bull from a cow, but we'd have these hair-raising
No bulls.
stories. I didn't mean to.
No, it sounds like you had a great childhood. You know, lots and lots
It
of
was,
fun and experiences, and you didn't get transported all over the place in the family car because
We didn't have a
they didn't.
family
I
car.
know.
Everybody walked in those days. In fact, when I was young, say 10 to 12, there were practically no cars around. Everybody walked. We used to slide in the wintertime down Union Street, and we'd start way up the top of what we called Joseph's Hill, which was beyond Tisdale Street, way up. And we would slide all the way down to Bill Gurry's house, or where the brook crosses Union Street.
Yeah, right.
We never ever had a car bother us at all, because they didn't come out at night. Cars lights, you see a few in the daytime, but you never saw any at night in those days.
The city didn't sand streets in, so God, it was beautiful.
They used to have wooden snow plows, horse-drawn wooden snow plow that plowed the sidewalks, not the streets, the sidewalks. They didn't care about the streets because there was no cars bothering enough.
That's very interesting.
The horse and sleighs did use the streets.
Do you remember the horse and sleighs going?
Yes, I remember.
Well,
I remember the old wooden snow plows.
On Tisdale Street, there was Mr. Pilecki that had a horse and a buggy.
Yes.
And Mr. Britton on Manchester
Yes,
Street,
had a
where
horse.
Jim lives
Had
now.
a horse. And
He had a horse and buggy.
Fred.
So,
Jim,
Fred Pilecki,
Pluckia. Yes,
And
he sold potatoes.
yeah. So,
100
100
pound
of
bags,
potatoes.
sacks.
and
Jim,
Alice,
they used to plow the sidewalks, but it was the kids on the double runners on Manchester Street and Upper Union Street that would plow the roads with remember the double runner?
Oh, the double runners,
and
yes.
And it would,
with those sleds,
you'd get a
double runner
long,
sleds.
long
Yes,
ride. You'd have
there would
12
be
kids
12
on a
feet
double
long.
runner.
Oh boy,
With
You
a
get 10,
small
12
stud in the front,
kids on the damn
small
thing.
front and the back.
was this
in front.
was this a toboggan or was it an actual double run?
no,
He said
it was a
runners.
sled.
It was a sled.
Double
A
runners.
double
Little
runner
small
sled, yeah.
sleds with a board
We call them
across
double
there.
runners.
Maybe
And-
a 12, 14 foot long.
Wow.
We
2
put
by
8 or
12.
10 people on them at a time.
But do you know,
We got in the back.
Wow.
the kids used to come up from Eden Glen
Yeah, Eden Glen.
in the winter, on a cold winter's night. You'd hear the bell. They'd ring the bell on their double runner as they're whipping up Union Street, and that was a signal. But myself and 2 girls who lived in my neighborhood to leave quickly as soon as you got your overshoes on and 8 layers of clothes and your hat and your mittens and 3 sets of long underwear. And you'd traipse up to the top of Manchester Street, where Pleasant Street intersects, and pile on that foolish double runner thing. And it was always these very obliging boys from Eden Glen, and what's the street going into Eden Glen off Graham?
Well, Eden Glen actually
Eden Glen
goes.
goes Eden's direction.
Right across.
Yeah, it's not one straight street.
Whatever,
I
I
think
mean-
that's Eden. Eden
And
Glen is on
I-
both sides
both
of
sides.
length.
I can mention names because they were the Miller boys and one of the Basque boys, and one of the kids, I don't know which one of the boys it was, would have his pet mouse or his pet white rat and take him for an outing. We didn't know this till after we'd known them a while. No one wanted to sit in back of him or near him on the double runner, but you'd have 12 kids packed on the double runner, and the bell would ring, and you'd get this long ride. Of course, then you had to climb back up the hill to get. No one was going to pull you up the hill.
It sounds like
But it was
great fun.
great.
Yeah, wonderful.
And you were perfectly safe, which is a sad thing that the children today
Yes.
are not allowed to do.
Chestnut
Well-
Street, Newton Street, them were
But,
all
it,
great
but
places.
t-
for
today you
sliding.
could obviously today with all the traffic it's impossible
Oh,
to do that. But in
impossible.
those days,
Well, that-
so literally you remember some horse.
Well, today you couldn't do it because the plow the street, and the next
Yeah.
day the streets are bare.
Right.
You
And
couldn't, so you can't.
so-
But in those days, they didn't plow the streets.
They didn't-
plowed the sidewalks, 'cause that's where the people walked.
That's
That's where they walked.
they walked
on
because
the
people
sidewalks, yes,
had because
and they-
most people walked to
All
work or
wooden,
walked to wherever
with
they
the
were going.
hospital, and it's all wooden.
So the
snowplow.
sidewalks were more important in those days than the
Yes, oh
streets.
yes, absolutely, yes.
Do you,
very
except
interesting.
occasionally there were, I happen to think, I don't mean to digress or interrupt, but I'm sure you remember when the young girl sliding down Crown Hill onto Central Street
Yep, got killed.
ran into a,
Yep.
yeah. She survived, but it was a terrible thing. That was, traffic was beginning, and whether it was daytime or not, can you remember that, Jim?
No,
She
I
was
don't
a
remember
girl
that.
who lived on South Street,
Is that right?
around
Yeah.
the corner, you know.
The-
But
Speaking of transportation and roads and sidewalks and things, we've already established that there weren't a lot of cars. What about streetcars, trolley tracks?
Yes,
Down Manchester Street, Pleasant. up
Where
Pleasant-
did they run? Did they run up that neighborhood? or-
yes.
Pleasant Street to Manchester Street, down Union Street and back to town.
And these were the track the
Yeah, with
trolleys that
the-
had
Oh, yes,
tracks and
yeah,
the wire over
Yes,
wire
absolutely,
overhead.
yes, yes. Those trolleys.
now, I don't, where were the
We used
trolley
to,
tracks?
They,
Level bus after that.
On, see, I don't remember the trolley tracks. I can remember Lovell Bustler.
oh no,
Bus line.
they come down Manchester and they
they did.
turned the corner and went down Union Street back to town.
Back to town, yeah, I remember.
But I can remember my neighbor worked for the railroad, and they used to have these big caps they used in the railroad. If they wanted to stop a train, they would put these on the tracks, and when the train ran over them, there was a loud explosion.
And
And we used to take a few of those once in a while, and we'd put it on the trolley track.
and
It was kind of a mean trick. It didn't do any damage, of course, but it did make a hell of a noise.
Old man to that on his.
Yes,
Yeah, I
yeah,
know.
he worked at the railroad all his
He
life.
sure did.
But
See what I mean about the boys?
Yeah,
No, the girls were
The girls didn't
learning
do
to
that.
cook and do these helpful things.
But when you get up to the 1938 hurricane, which did tremendous damage, and I just about took every pine tree in the state down, they set up on Union Street. There was a big vacant field just this side of Litchfield Street, and the government hired a sawyer. That's somebody who has a mill. He took his whole mill and brought it down from down south somewhere, and he set it up in the field just before you get to Litchfield Street. And I got a job there taken away from the saw, and they would saw these big pine trees, some of them two or 3 feet through, and these logs 2 inches thick and from 10 to 30 feet across, 14, 15, 18 feet long. They come off of that saw, and they went through the edge, and then they were packed, piled on the platform back of the saw, and then they were taken from there, and they pile them down back on the flat area of the field, and in between each layer of boards, they would put these cross pieces so the boards would cure and aerated through there. There was millions of feet of this pine that was stacked down there, and many people thought it's going to rot there, they'll never use it. And along came the war, and they used every last board in that field was gone by the end of the war.
The Second World War.
The wood was used for packing cases to ship overseas. They used every bit of it.
Those trees that had been blown down during the hurricane of
Yes,
'38
yes.
and then were sawn up, and then
Yes.
they were used
And-
World
and
War II.
It was a tough job. I wasn't that big, and but those boards were real heavy. I used to wake up in the middle of the night, both arms are paralyzed. I couldn't move them.
Oh, wow.
And, I used to pray that the saw would hit a big spike because some of those trees are neighborhood trees and they're full of nails and spikes. And when the saw hit those, why, everything shut down.
But you know, the safety devices weren't in place, and the safety rules and regs
Oh,
and
for sure.
age limitations.
This is all very, very interesting. I heard Lovell Bus Company mentioned. You remember, all three of you remember the Lovell bus line?
Yes?
I don't. I remember FNL.
remember.
Little short Pelkey being the driver.
Remember what?
Well, I
hear
don't
that.
know the
I'm sorry,
driver.
I didn't hear that.
The Lovell bus line. Do you remember the Lovell buses?
A nickel you'd get on in town, and you'd go up Pleasant Street,
I remember the,
Manchester.
I
For a
remember,
nickel. That was
I
the- that
remember
was the
the trolley to Worcester.
There was
Yeah.
a trolley that went to
Trolley
Worcester
went down Central Street to Worcester.
on tracks. Or was
On
it
tracks, yes.
So the tracks ran all the way to
All
Worcester.
the way to Worcester, yes. And
Also,
one of the
Leominster.
drivers lived right beside me, name of Cy Davis. And he later retired, but he was the driver of those trolleys back in those days.
But Jim, there were trolley lines out to Leominster Park,
Oh, Whalum
and
Park,
to Whaler Park,
Whalum Park,
yeah.
yes.
which were
Pittsburgh.
Now,
Waits Corner.
all that area, but there was a very extensive, elaborate trolley line. And Alice, you mentioned we know where Whalum Park is, but maybe a lot of the listening audience perhaps doesn't know about Leominster Park. Leominster Lake, Leominster Park was behind what would be the
Italian
former
Club.
Italian
Oh, yes.
Center, near the
Way down
Leominster
there.
Babe
Yes,
Ruth League
yes,
Field.
yeah.
But that was a very, very extensive, quite a place.
Definitely.
Yes, it was. There
I
was a
forgot
dam
the
there,
reason.
and it backed up the Nashua River and made a lake.
It was
But
called
it was-
Leominster
it was-
Lake.
Lake,
Yes.
It was also to
I
keep
worked with a
generating
couple
money out of the
old-timers that
trolleys.
Used to go dancing there in the.
Yeah.
Now, Lou, you used to go dancing where?
No, I was at the Leominster Lake.
Down at Leominster Lake.
Yeah.
Okay.
A couple
The
of old
invest-
timers I worked with, yeah.
They used to, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they used
They
The
remember.
investors didn't want these trolley cars idle. They were very busy during the week when people were using them to go to work. Weekends, quieter, so they developed these Whalum Park and Leominster. What did they call it?
Leominster Lake.
Leominster Lake as recreation areas where people could go on Sundays or their day off, have a picnic and enjoy the country and so forth, and have a ride on the trolley.
I remember doing some research about Leominster Lake down behind the former Italian Center and Babe Ruth League Field. And in the 1890s, or that period, approximately around turn of the century, there would be as many as 5,000 picnickers and revelers down there. And there was actually, as Jim said, there was a dam which was there, and it backed up a lake that was called Leominster Lake to almost behind, I guess, St. Cecilia's Cemetery. And there was a lake there. And then I guess eventually the dam burst. But the dam was there there was a steam generating plant for to generate, I guess, electricity for the trolleys, I assume. And there was also a linen mill. I've come across a little linen mill. But if you look at some of the old pictures, you would be amazed at what was down there. It was really quite a place.
You know, way back when, and I'm not sure when, but Jim brought it to mind, the horn supply.
The horn supply.
On supply.
Horns from cows and
Yes.
stuff, and they'd steam the things and then make combs out of them and decorative
my
hair
father
pieces and
Yes.
stuff.
Cut comb teeth for patents down there in Central and Graham Street.
Horn Supply, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the present location for the audience. It's where the new CVS is
Yes,
on
yeah,
Central
that's
Street.
right. Yeah.
Someone just coming to Leominster today would say, well, there's a CVS there, but it wasn't so long ago that there was a building there that, if you go way, way back, it was the Leominster Horn and Supply
It was
Company.
right smack on the street.
The last
Right.
man that worked there lived right beside me. And he used to bring the sawdust from cutting the combs, and it made great fertilizer.
'Cause it was,
But it stunk like
Yes.
everything. But he had his garden across the street from his house, but he used to put it on his garden, and it
But
really
the
made him
smell,
grow.
Jim.
the,
Do you remember the odor? My grandmother used to complain about the odor.
Oh yes, you could smell them once you get near the
I
place.
mean, really bad.
I grew up in that neighborhood, and
Well,
I know exactly what you mean, Alice and Jim.
Yeah.
We had an expression, it smells like the horn supply, because those horns were animal horns.
Yes.
And you mentioned the sawdust. It wasn't wood sawdust. This was
No,
dust
yeah.
from
Dust
cutting the
that would be
combs. It
stuff.
was,
Yeah.
it was the
Yeah.
animal horns, and
Animal
of course
horns.
that would, as it decayed, it would
Yes.
smell.
Yeah.
My grandmother would send me to the store up at the corner of just going back toward town.
Janelle's.
Just on the Janelle's Market.
Yes.
To do grocery shopping. And I hated going by the Horn Supply. We'd hold on
Yeah.
hours
In,
going
in
by.
the
It was
summertime, if the wind was right,
very
it had quite an aroma.
odoriferous.
Yes.
Well, you know, things were tough in those days. There was very little work around, and a lot of people weren't working. I can remember that there was a fellow up the corner of Tisdale and Union, and he made a living by polishing cars. And there were a lot of people who were retired because they got laid off. We used to play cards in the afternoon sometimes. And of course, I picked up the odd jobs. And back in those days, you didn't have the equipment that you have today. For instance, when it come to shoveling, there was no snow blowers.
No manual
it was
labor.
all shovel. You had to shovel the snow. If they're going to put a pipe down the street, it was all done by hand, pick and shovel.
Pick and shovel.
No diggers. I worked for the WPA. That's a Work Progress Administration. We worked 3 days a week for $12, and that was pick and shovel. We were digging trenches to lay pipe. I laid pipe from corner of King's Corner all the way down North Street. We dug that whole stretch by hand.
All right. And that was during the
That was during
the 30s.
the early 30s.
The early 30s, the
Yes.
works, the WPA,
Yeah.
and you were probably glad to have that job.
Oh, absolutely. Well, oh, yes, we were. And I say, things were tough back in those days. It was, of course, in '28, they had the stock market crash. And for the next few years, I graduated in '33, and it's almost impossible to get a job at that time. I recall applying for a job one place, and it said, put down the last places you've worked. They didn't have enough room on that form to fill all the places I'd worked in the last 2 years, because you'd work 2 weeks here and a week there, and you just went from job to job wherever you could get scratch something to.
So,
And also, I'd like to bring up the blueberry and we used to do in the summertime.
Oh, God.
We would, in the August, it seemed like the whole street of Tisdale Street moved out. At crack of dawn, we all walked up, we'd walk up Manchester Street and up
Low
Low
Street,
Street, and then there
right.
was a cross cut. We cut across the land and wound up where the dog kennels are today. And then we walked from there up to
Elm Street.
Yeah, all the way up Elm Street to the reservoir, and we picked blueberries on the hill opposite the reservoir up there until about 1 o'clock, and then we walked all the way back home. That was the easy part. The hard part then was to go house to house selling the blueberries. 15 cents a quart.
Didn't you sell any to the stores? Some of the
Well,
stores
they didn't
used to
get so
have-
much money.
Where,
We
Stores wanted them for
they
nothing.
won them for about 12 cents a quart, and we would.
where was Rocky Hill?
Rocky Hill?
Because my grandmother used to take us to
That's
Rocky
where
Hill.
that's where we went.
Yeah,
Rocky
we
Hill.
stayed all day,
Yes.
and the thing that disturbed me, there were snakes.
This is up
and
beyond little
I'm not
Haynes
squeamish,
Reservoir.
but I can't stand snakes.
I know.
Well,
Plus, you'd take your lunch. My Uncle John would drop us off in the morning with my grandmother, and we'd stay all day, because Uncle John worked, and he wouldn't get back there till, I don't know, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And, you know, you didn't have sunscreen, and you didn't have bug repellent, and you didn't have snake repellent, and in warm weather, and there are rattlers. I mean, you know, in the warmer weather, they come out in sun on, I can't say I ever ran into a rattler, but I have seen snakes, and I early on decided, as soon as I could afford it, when I was 70, I wouldn't pick blueberries if I had them in the backyard. And if they were $8 a pint,
You're
I'd
still
say,
going to.
never. I don't begrudge anyone what they charge for blueberries, except the ones you get today are cultivated, Jim.
Yes.
They're not
they're
as
bigger, much
flavorful.
bigger, yes, and cultivated, yeah. But they're
and
not as sweet as the ones we used to pick.
I know, but,
No.
but my grandmother didn't want us to pick them. We had to take the leaves out and the
Oh,
green
yeah,
ones.
you had to pick
Oh,
them.
Clean 'em.
Oh,
I
you
hated
clean them,
that
yeah,
job.
before you sold them, yes.
hated it.
The,
Yeah, pick all the little
we,
pickers out. And,
the folks in those days they'd go blueberrying. Did you grow a lot of your own? Did people have families have gardens?
Well, what they grew was they all had gardens and chickens,
Yeah.
Yep.
and big gardens. I mean, they raised tomatoes and cucumbers and
200
carrots and
tomato
lettuce.
plants.
Oh yes, and
And so the chicken, I know my grandparents had chickens,
Yeah.
got rabbits. I remember I used to, it was fun as a kid. I used to enjoy gathering the eggs. I thought it was a big deal in the nest,
Right.
you know, in the hen house. But what about the markets we live in an era of supermarkets, and what about the markets when you had to go to the store?
they would buy them, but
We had Tebow's Market between Gallagher's and
They were little markets, neighborhood markets. Tebow's was one.
market.
Yep.
Yes,
Bates's Market.
Bates's
on
Market,
Street.
Manchester Street.
and Cobley's Market.
Cobley's, where was that one?
and remember
That
Mr.
was
Oh,
Remember Mr. Parker, who used to sell extracts with a little wagon
Yes,
from
yes,
Manchester
yes.
Street? He sold vanilla extract out of
and
his
he
little
made them
wagon.
himself. He made them mixed it. himself.
My mother and my grandmother wouldn't use Mr. Parker's vanilla extract because it was not a flavor. I don't know what the problem was anyway, but they would buy other things. But he brewed these things in this.
Yes.
I mean, and then during the summer, at one point, he was letting kids take his stuff out to sell.
Oh yes.
You know, on a percentage basis
my
and
sister
so
used
forth.
to sell his
But I never could
extract.
sell any of Mr. Parker's
Yes,
extracts.
well,
And he'd have this red wagon,
he had
and
a
he'd
lot of
walk to
different-
town. Remember the poor farmer up where
Oh, yeah.
Holy
The
Family
city
is?
poor farm up on
And
New Street, which
the
is
poor
presently a
souls
church.
that would walk from where Holy Family Church is today.
Yes, I do remember that.
Down on Saturdays, downtown. And I can remember one lady
Nellie.
who was,
That was Nellie.
right,
High shoes up
such
up,
a gracious
halfway up her foot.
lady. I mean, it looked as though she came from a lovely
Very big hat on her.
what a
Yes.
love, but disturbed and was in the poor farm. But they would walk down and
All
then
the way
walk
from the
back,
profile.
you know, all dressed
That's
up.
about,
But they sat on the
miles.
porch and rocked.
The city
and-
infirmary, the poor.
City
I mean, it was
infirmary.
a sad thing.
Yes.
yeah, they shut it down.
Well, between Tisdale Street and the church, all right, that was all woods.
woods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A few little orchards in there.
Yeah.
and
How much that has changed now.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember the Ku Klux Klan over on Gardner Hill?
No, I don't.
My Uncle Frank.
Very faintly.
My Uncle Frank was a member, and it was he who told we children about the Ku Klux Klan on Gardner Hill burning crosses and stuff. Now, I can vaguely remember on a summer night or something, I don't know whether this was a dream or fantasy, and so awakening, and seeing the outline of which Gardner Hill being over in back of Barrett Park Pond. Barrett Park. Doris Barrett and I were classmates.
Oh, is that so?
Doris had the ice pond, which was where Leominster Ice cut their ice.
Little barracks.
But the little house was Doris's playhouse. And I would mosey on down from Crown Street up to number 1 Chestnut, and we would go out and play out in the house. I'm not sure whether it's the recreation director's place now or not, but it was a neat place. It was not a public, I guess they donated or leased it to the city as a public recreation facility later, but anyway, I don't mean to digress and bounce, but as I think of things.
Thankfully, the Ku Klux Klan, they didn't get established.
Yeah.
They didn't get established. They got really driven out, thankfully, in our area. So, thank God.
I don't recall.
Doris Barrett is still living in
I
New York.
recall reading something, coming across
There was something in the Worcester paper during the summer, about a year ago, about Barrett, about Leominster Ice and ice cubes and, you know, by the bushel.
Yes.
And I sent it to Doris Barrett, who is a friend who lives in New York. And she was most interested.
It was nice of you to
Things
do that,
change.
Allison.
The thing I remember about the ice company was I helped dig the water line from Pleasant Street all the way back to their ice house, which was probably a quarter of a mile.
Oh, that's quite a way.
And that was the hardest digging I ever saw, because
That whole area.
it was all slate and
Ledge.
rock, and you'd pick and pick, and then you
what-
finally get a shovel full.
What a contrast between then and now, because you see these massive digging
Oh.
machines that in a day or an hour will
They'd
do
a
what
day what 100 men
men would
could
do. Right? So that's a big change.
On the
That-
corner of Manchester and Coleman Street. The farmers used to bring in the rocks, and the city had a stone crusher.
I remember the rock crusher, the
Yes.
stone crusher. I used to
Yes,
go
oh.
up and target shoot the sandbank
Yeah,
behind
right.
there.
Yeah.
Clarence Moss I used to work for him. He was a farmer up on Union
You're
Street.
way up on top of Union.
And he used to haul rocks over to the
Yeah.
stone crusher. And he was hauling them out of Lincoln's Woods because there was a lot of stone walls in there. And he eliminated all those stone walls because he took
Property
the
lines, yeah.
he took
Oh,
the rocks
can't
over
do
and
that.
had them crushed.
There are laws
He got
against
so
that.
much a ton for them.
Developing that point, like we have massive earth-moving machines today, and in those days it was pick and shovel. Today we have telephones, we have cell phones, we have modern refrigeration, we have washing machines, microwave ovens, central heat, radio, TV, all this. Telephones, Alice, and your days, did you have, Jim, Louis, were phones common? Were telephones common?
No.
They were-
We didn't have a telephone until I was about, well, my oldest sister went to work at Richardson Piano Case Company, and she earned enough money to put in electric lights. And
What did she have before that? Kerosene or gas? Or?
We had Yes, kerosene lamps.
Kerosene lamps.
But,
And then later
Jim-
on, she did get us a telephone.
Ah,
Jim, there were two
This
party
is before
lines.
my time, believe me.
There were
Yes.
2 party lines, 4 party lines, 8 party lines, 15 party lines out in the country.
now a party line was...
Meaning there are 2 people sharing the same line. So you'd have 162W and 162M. If it rang once, it was M, once for W and 2 for M. So you knew from the ring whether it was your telephone or whether it was Mary
Somebody
Smith's down the road. And of course, people would interrupt. They'd listen in on each other. I mean, it was, and on the 15 party lines,
15
way
party
out,
line.
way out Pleasant Street towards Sterling. I mean, it was absolute. I don't know how people ever used it. I mean, it was.
And
insane.
you had, when you made a call, you had to deal with an operator, right?
Yes.
sorry?
When you made a call, you had to deal with an
You give
operator.
the
You just
operator
didn't-
the number.
Number,
Yes.
please.
Number, please,
Yeah.
and it wasn't. It was
But
pre.
it was,
this was pre the dial. This was pre the push button. This was hello.
I just returned
Yeah, some of them
yesterday.
had a crank on them.
Wow.
Yeah. I just returned my 2 AT&T phones, which I have leased since the divestiture because I like rotary dial. But I've had to come into the 21st century and go for push button.
You're in the 21st century now, Alice. You have push button phones. I can sympathize with you because
You mentioned World War II. I was working for the telephone company. I was one of these people that would plug in and say, number, please. You know, 162W, 162W, M was whatever. All of a sudden, on a Sunday afternoon, I think it was, on December 7, 1941, all of a sudden, the whole board lit up. A light would appear on the switchboard when someone picked up their telephone to call. And, you know, you just didn't know. And on Sunday afternoon, there would be very limited staff on duty because of low usage. People were at home, they were resting, reading the paper, having a nap, or taking a walk or something. And it was just a frightening thing. And once I don't remember how we learned, whether someone listened in and you couldn't begin to answer all these calls. Everyone's picking up their phone, did you hear? And it was an exciting time.
Yeah.
And a scary time.
I can imagine. Hacking back to like telephones, what about refrigeration? Did you have an ice box, or did you have
Shorty, the Iceman, and all
So
the high school
what was
football
an ice-
players would be working for Leominster Ice in the summertime.
Yeah.
And they wore a rubber apron on their backs because you were whipping, and this is a horse and drawn
They put the ice on
carriage.
their
Ice
back.
wagon.
The
And they carried
rubber
it.
wagon apron is on your back because you're schlepping, you know, and the user in the house would have a cardboard sign, and it would say 15, 25, 50, 100, meaning
put that on your window?
pounds of ice. So
Right.
you'd put, if you needed 25 pounds, you put the 25 in your window. And on a couple days a week, Shorty the Iceman would appear with his horse and park in front of the house, look in the window, and Mrs. Emory would want 25 pounds, so he'd chip off 25 pounds, slip it on his back. And your mother would put newspapers down so that they wouldn't mess up to put it in the ice box. And,
Was the
and there was a
refrigerator was
drain
literally
pipe
an ice
down below
box.
with a pan
Yes.
in which the melted
Right.
ice
And you,
let loose. But while Shorty was in the house, and I'm sure you guys did this, we kids would be out there, and somebody in our neighborhood, someone of the real nice boys, would have an ice pick,
Oh, sure.
which he'd swiped out of his mother's pantry. Would be chipping off
The
pieces
ice.
of ice.
Suck on.
Kids are all,
And it was a precious commodity, so you'd be grabbing pieces of ice to, you know, soothe your fevered brow, to just suck on or something. And then Shorty would come charging out of your mother's house, threatening war, murder, all sorts of mayhem, and we'd disappear like, you remember that?
Yes.
Lovely children.
So there were ice men,
Yes.
milkmen,
Milkmen. Oh,
milkmen,
yes.
bread men.
plus...
I worked...
Yes.
Mr. Zinner was a meat man.
Meat,
He had a meat
you would bring
wagon.
meat wet.
Fishman.
Fishman.
I worked for Newton's Dairy, peddling their milk.
I'd love to see his resume.
And I think it was the last horse and buggy. Old Harry Jenkins had the horse and buggy. All the other workers had trucks. But Harry still was using the horse and buggy. Excuse me. And we would pedal all over town. I would start at 1 o'clock in the morning, and we'd peddle milk till 6 in the morning. And what I didn't like is what we call French Hill.
Oh, these.
Down, and they had these three deckers, and somebody wanted a pint of milk on the third
Way up
floor.
on the third floor.
And,
Yeah, after you brought that up, then they wanted some butter, so you had to go back down and get the butter.
or next to a quart or a pint of cream or something, you went down and back up again.
How
I worked with Buell Hatfield for a while.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Yeah.
that's an immense difference, contrast between then and now, where the home delivery is
Nobody,
about...
I don't think anybody
Yeah,
goes
yeah.
house to house now. Nobody.
Yeah, very little house
You know,
time.
Cherry and
When
Leominster
you
was one of the
mention
last
heating
ones.
and cook, I'm sorry.
Go
When you
ahead.
mention heating and cooking, we had a, well, it was wood or coal, and then ultimately converted to oil.
Wood stove, coal stove,
Stove
and
in the
converted to
kitchen,
oil
yeah.
heat.
Yeah.
And you'd come in from skating or sliding or something in the winter. And your mother would have hot chocolate ready, hopefully. And the oven door would be open, and there was a running board in the front of the... And you'd sit there. There were 3 in my family. My sister and I being the older. My brother was slightly smaller. He didn't count. And you'd have your shoes and your socks off, and your feet up on the running
Dry
board,
out.
toasting in front of this oven. It was lovely,
It sounds
lovely.
like-
And it would take you, I think this is why I'm cold today still, but it would take a long time to thaw
I,
those frozen toes and feet.
just a personal thing, I remember as a little kid, my grandparents' house, they had a big black coal,
Right.
beautiful
Oh.
stove with the chrome
Oh,
on it, but
with
it
the
was,
chrome
and
on
they
it.
heated both, it burned both wood and coal, and I was little enough so that in the winter when I'd go over there for a visit with my mom, we'd walk over. I was tiny enough so I would snuggle up under I could sneak under the
Right.
stove because it was nice and toasty there.
Oh, yeah. They were beautiful, and your grandmother would keep it shining. I
Oh.
mean, she would polish
Yeah.
this thing.
Yeah, we had black polish they used to polish the stove with.
Jim,
it-
didn't some of these have a well for hot water too, or something?
Yes, they did.
And then
On
the
end
oven,
of
the
stove,
oven was
they had a well.
marvelous. The oven was
of
marvelous for
them.
baking.
I have to ask, because today we have the TV, we're at the cable studio today with television, and radio. You grew up,
I had ear sets, 2 ear sets.
you had,
I can remember when FDR was running for his 3rd term, because I was born in 1919, so I became 21 in 1940. And we had I don't know whether it's a Majestic or what, but it was a 2-earpiece radio set. So logically, your father got one and your mother got 1 ear set. Well, there were 3 kids. And as I said, my brother was younger, but my sister and I were interested. And my mother would take pity and let us take turns listening to the radio and listening to
headset.
all the wonderful dialogue that went into, you know, a 3rd-term election, plus the war being imminent, and with all the things going on in Europe with World War II and stuff. There was such exciting and interesting things going on in radio. H.V. Kelton born, and
The
the
commentator.
people, Morrow, who was reporting from England, and we go way back, guys, don't we? You know, I have a problem, though. I'm into the 21st century, and I think to myself, gee, that's, I'm not used to 20. In fact, when I'm writing checks now, do you do it? I found myself writing 1903 instead of 2003.
Absolutely, I do it too.
Yeah.
1903. Yes, it's so easy to do that.
These,
Well,
I have
Coming
to,
home from Bennett School, the Coughlin family lived on Coleman Street. They were quite elderly. Come on, sit down and listen to the ball game.
listen to the ball game.
Listen to the ball game with the Coughlins. They'd always give us the score up to that point, and
Yeah,
very nice
from
people.
they picked it up over the radio.
Over the radio.
Yeah, I had a neighbor that I used to go over to listen to his radio because we couldn't afford a radio.
How times have changed, and in some ways we've made progress, but in some ways it was in many ways it was warmer and nicer.
deal.
Although today it all depends on attitude, I'm sure, but.
Yeah, but I think the thing that I noticed, I don't know my neighbors anymore.
Right, that
I know
is
one,
sad. Right.
But I think neighbors cared about each other. Mothers weren't working to the degree they do today, and so that they knew what their kids were doing and where their kids were going, and we looked after, or you know, they'd invite you over for supper and so forth, and it was, I think it was a safer time. It was a poorer time economically.
But
growing
only
up.
economically, not in terms of human values.
But
and
no, it is different.
yeah.
But
Of course,
I just
I-
happen to think of something to ask Lou. Do you remember playing King of the Hill and Run My Good Sheep Run? Remember at the corner of Union and Crown?
Yep.
Grace Hatt was here, and I was here, and Mary Crane was there.
Yeah, Mary Crane, yeah.
And we'd play King of the Mountain. It would be the girls against the boys. But we'd always bring in a couple of older girls, plus the whole theme of the thing was knocking the boys on their posteriors down the hill. And Jack Crane, who was a very dear friend of mine, was wearing braces as a child. He had it was just a corrective thing. It wasn't anything, you know, a terribly serious thing anyway. Jack would be in the forefront climbing the hill. We'd let him get to about this far, and then we'd shove him back down.
Alice.
But we used to, I mean, really, we were a mean bunch of girls, but I think we were paying all these boys back because they were doing the interesting things and encouraged to play baseball, football, anything, you know, the 3 Bs, and we were doing the cooking and the babysitting.
Well, I have to conclude. It sounds as though you're 3 wonderful people, and you were. I'm sure you were great kids, and you turned out to be wonderful adults, and you have so many wonderful, great memories to share with us. From listening to you folks reminisce, I can tell that the Bowery was a nice place. The Bowery neighborhood was a great neighborhood to spend your childhood in and to live in and to grow up in. As it is today, it's still a fine place in Leominster to live.
May I say, it's been a nostalgic trip for me.
Well,
I've enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
One fine story I'd like to tell is about Andy Buckham playing football across the street from the house. He gets knocked out.
Oh,
So the boys pick him up, put him in a bed in my house. For a couple of days, Dr. Curley finally come up and says, he can go home now.
Never 2 days.
Louis, that's a good one.
He was
Casual.
one of my buddies, Andy Buckham.
Oh, what a beautiful man.
Yeah,
Well-
he was. He and Ethel Moulton, I were quite friendly.
They used to walk all the way from uptown. Up to,
They were great times. They were great times.
sure
Mr.
were.
Cocci, Louis,
yes.
Mr. Gardner, Jim, and Mrs. Pickford, Alice. I thank you very, very much for sharing your memories of growing up in the Bowery neighborhood of Leominster with us and with our audience. And I want to thank the audience of Leominster for their attention. Thank you very much.